high-level talks between the U.S. and Russia over the war in Ukraine. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was sitting directly across from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The U.S. says the initial talks were aimed at laying the groundwork for ending the war, even though Ukraine and its European allies were notably absent. A short time ago, U.S. and Russian officials weighed in on the high-stakes meeting and the path going forward. CNN's Alex Marquardt is in Riyadh, and Nick Payton-Walsh has the view from Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. Nick, let's start with you. You have some strong new reaction from the Ukrainian president.
Yeah, you mentioned there how Ukraine was not party to these talks, that increasingly from the readout we've got seemed to be about the improvement of American and Russian relations, notably the improving of diplomatic relations and embassies in Washington and Moscow. We've had our first reaction to this meeting essentially about Ukraine. We thought without Ukraine being there, from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who said in Ankara, Turkey, sort of hovering around the Gulf area over the past few days, saying he would go to Saudi Arabia tomorrow. That, he said, was a bilateral meeting, not related to these talks, but I think many thought perhaps there was some suggestion in his mind maybe he may end up involved somehow. Well, that's now not going to happen. He's just announced that he will be cancelling tomorrow's trip to Saudi Arabia, postponing it till the 10th of March. That's a long way down the line in diplomatic terms. He also says we want an end to the war, we want it to be fair, and nothing that anyone decides behind our backs. I think that's fair. He goes on to say we weren't invited to this Russian-American meeting. It was a surprise for many people. We got the information from the media. I don't really care who will stay in Riyadh and who's leaving. I don't care if our partners think something unnecessary about us. Determined, perhaps a little angry there, and certainly deciding that any fallout from this meeting, we do seem to get the impression that the Americans and Russians are not staying on for further talks, doesn't involve Ukraine at this point. Zelensky will receive the American Trump administration envoy to Russia and Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, here, likely Thursday, Friday. But this is a stark reaction to talks which do appear to have been essentially about improving the American-Russian relationship, possibly making a peace deal in Ukraine part of that wider deal, then the focus of that main deal. And perhaps I think this reaction from the Ukrainian president a sign of how little progress perhaps they feel has been made to their benefit there, and really how isolated they've begun to feel over the past weeks.
Yeah, they clearly feel iced out. Alex, so what is Secretary Rubio saying about the meeting and any tangible outcome?
Well, Pam, I think that the only tangible from this is essentially a lack of tangibles. I mean, it's clear that the discussions were wide-ranging, but they're not walking away from Riyadh with any kind of concrete solutions or conclusions about what's actually going to end up happening in Ukraine. I think Nick's point is absolutely right. Both the U.S. and Russia were approaching this not just about the war in Ukraine and how to end it, but looking at the broader set of relations across the board between the U.S. and Russia. We do have a rather specific list from the State Department of what was agreed to in terms of the conversations that will be going forward. At the top of that list is essentially reestablishing the general functioning of the two embassies in Moscow and Washington. Over the past 3 years during this war, each embassy has been gutted, with diplomats and intelligence officials who have been kicked out of each country. And then the second point was specifically about Ukraine and naming high-level teams to negotiate directly about the war in Ukraine. We don't know who's actually going to be on those teams. And then the third point was more forward-looking, and this gets to that broader conversation, that broader relationship between the two countries. Here, interestingly, you have the U.S. talking about the potential for historic economic and investment opportunities that would follow between the U.S. and Russia after the war ends in Ukraine. And then finally, that last point, just generally speaking, that the 5 principals who sat at the table today in this palace here in Riyadh will continue to talk. But what was clear, Pamela, is that the way that the U.S. viewed this is that this was talks about more talks. Here's what Secretary Rubio had to say just a short time ago.
But we have to understand that it's been 3.5 years since there's been any sort of regularized contact between the United States and Russia, and in some cases between any of the participants in this conflict and Russia. So the goal of today's meeting was to follow up on the phone call the President had a week ago and begin to establish those lines of communication. The work remains. Today is the first step of a long and difficult journey.
And Pamela, there had also been some thinking that this meeting would lead to a summit between Presidents Putin and Trump, perhaps as early as next week, both the U.S. and Russian sides making it sound like that is very unlikely. No date, we are told, has been set for that meeting. Pamela?
All right. Nick Paton-Walsh, Alex Marquardt, thank you so much. Let's continue this conversation. Joining us now are CNN Global Affairs analyst Kim Dozier and former CNN Moscow bureau chief Jill Doherty. Kim, what do you make of Zelensky postponing his trip to Saudi Arabia? That seems like a significant and perhaps negative development in the overarching goal of reaching a peace deal. How do you read it?
Well, it's one way to send a message that he doesn't like how the White House has handled these opening talks with Russia, that he doesn't feel like he's been looped in. And when you widen out to the European community, they all feel gut punched and slapped in the face that after years of close cooperation through the Ramstein process under the Biden administration, this time they didn't even get the courtesy of a heads up that, hey, President Trump is going to follow through with his promise to try to make peace between Ukraine and Russia with his phone call with Vladimir Putin that he had last week. And from there, we're going to see if we can have face-to-face lower level talks. If anyone had gotten that heads up instead of the way this unfolded, with everyone hearing from Trump out of the Oval Office about things, and then the bruising comments from a series of U.S. officials in Brussels and Munich, they feel very differently. So one of the only things Zelensky can do is withdraw his presence and say, you're not going to bully us into this.
And Jill, the Kremlin has framed the meeting as aimed at restoring U.S.-Russian relations. Do you think Putin is using this to regain relevance on the international stage rather than actually achieving a peace deal with Ukraine?
Well, I mean, they eventually will probably get around to trying to establish some type of peace deal or at least a ceasefire. But I think, if you look directly at what the Russian representative, Yuri Yushakov, who is a very experienced diplomat, was saying, you would have known right from the beginning that the primary thing that they wanted to do, the Russians, was to restore normal relations with the United States. And then Ukraine is down in second place. I think it's really important. This is where it gets really complicated. The way the United States looks at it, and it's being defined right now, is we've got to get back in communication. The previous administration, Biden, had no communication with the Russians. Ergo, we have to get back to talking. The Russians look at this as not just talking. The mere fact that they are meeting, the mere fact that they are going to talk is hugely important for the Kremlin, because it means Russia's back on the stage. They're already talking about, putting ambassadors back into the embassies, talking, et cetera. This is exactly what Putin wants. The end of isolation and the beginning of bringing Russia back and bringing Putin back onto the world stage. That's what they want. And they are definitely getting it right now.
And to follow up on that, Moscow and Trump himself have talked about meeting in person between Trump and Putin, potentially a summit between the two. President Trump has said that could happen very soon. Why is that so significant and more significant than a phone call?
Well, because summits are a big deal. I mean, really, you can just imagine President Trump, President Putin sitting down after all of this time, a war now maybe being brought to an end, restoration of relations. This would be a very big event on the world stage. It would be something that President Trump wants, definitely, because I can't imagine a bigger photo op. And then President Putin wants that because it would just kind of put the stamp on his being back. Now, none of this is necessarily bad. The countries eventually do have to get talking. But the problem is, as we're all looking at this, we're thinking it is negotiations, beginning of negotiations about Ukraine. But really what it is, it's about the United States and Russia and then Ukraine. And that's why Zelensky is having a problem. And that is why the Europeans are having huge problems, because many of the things that the Russians are saying and they're saying them very precisely, are the demands that Vladimir Putin had right before he invaded Ukraine in 2022. And that's where they want to go back to that, which means no NATO, nowhere, get NATO out of Europe. And that's extremely, extremely significant.
It certainly is. Jill, Kim, thank you so much.